Hello, folks, and welcome to Quarantine Coffee Hour. Yay. I'm your host, Derek Pratt, the educator here at the Erie Canal Museum. I'm happy to be joined by the manager of visitor experience at the Bytown Museum in Ottawa, Canada, Steve Mattiusi.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about the Rideau Canal. But before we get started, you know the drill. We got to wait for some people to get on here and start watching us. Let's look at what I'm drinking today. There's a big bombshell coming. Just wait. Got my Jack Kerouac mug today as we're taking a bit of a road trip these last couple weeks on Quarantine Coffee Hour. We were at the D&H Canal last week. We're in Ottawa. Next week, we're going to have Tim Roth from the New Jersey Canal Society of New Jersey, talking about the Morris Canal. So it should all be pretty fun. And here's the big news. I am not drinking recess coffee today. No, it's Cafe Kubal, another locally produced Syracuse coffee shop.
Very nice.
Or coffee. So remember, folks, buy local. As we all know, local businesses are hurting as a result of coronavirus, as are your local museums. So if you've been enjoying this, we encourage you, please, if you could donate to the museum, $5 or something. Maybe be a member. Who knows? But anyway, also, please say hello in the comments and tell us where you're from. Also, please, we encourage you to ask questions throughout this. But that's enough for me today. I will send it over to you, Steve, to talk about the Rideau Canal.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Derek, and thank you to the Erie Canal Museum for having me on and representing the Bytown Museum here in Ottawa, Canada. It's a real thrill to be here, and it's always fun to talk about the Rideau Canal because talking about canals and the history of canals is always fun. I think we can both agree with that. So I am Steve Mattiusi. I'm the manager of visitor experience at the Bytown Museum. We're Ottawa's oldest community museum. We're housed in Ottawa's oldest stone building. So it's pretty fun work in there, to say the least. And we do cover a great deal of the history of the Rideau Canal. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a historic site in Canada. It's key to, well, it's the reason Ottawa is there today, and it's key to the history of Eastern Ontario, the history of Canada as well. So to begin with, I thought I'd start with just sort of a general history of the Rideau Canal. So as you can see here on the screen, we have a lovely map of Upper and Lower Canada, as well as the northeastern United States. You can see New York State peeking up from the bottom there. So right in the middle of this map, you might see it's a pretty small line, but that is the Rideau Canal. So you can see it sort of cut from the Ottawa River down to Kingston on Lake Ontario. It's sort of just to the just beside the Canada in Upper Canada. Now, why is the Rideau Canal there? Why was it built? Well, unfortunately, Canada and the United States did not always get along as they do today. And there was a little event in the early 1800s called the War of 1812, where after what the United States considered to be several insults and injuries to its sovereignty by Britain, they declared war on the United Kingdom and invaded the colonies of the Canadas. Now, this was really not a win for either side. I think a lot of Canadians like to think we sort of won the War of 1812. I think a decent amount of Americans like to think they won the War of 1812. It was really a draw, let's be honest. However, it was still pretty nerve-wracking for the British authorities back in England that the United States, if they wanted to, could sort of just up and invade the colony of Canada. So they decided, under the direction of the Duke of Wellington, to engage in a series of defensive works. Prime among them was this idea of a canal to make the transportation of troops and materials much easier throughout the colonies. So essentially, the way they moved troops, the way they moved materials before was using the St. Lawrence River. Now, the problem with that is it's probably not the best idea to have your main transportation route for troop movements also be the border with the country you're at war with. So to get from Montreal down to Kingston, Lake Ontario, and the sort of the southwestern portion of Upper Canada to link the two Canadas, you use the St. Lawrence and you used what was called the transshipment system. Essentially, it's a fancy way of saying you got on a boat in Montreal. Eventually, though, down the St. Lawrence, you'd have to get off, portage a bit, get back on the boat, go down the river a bit more, get off, portage. It was expensive, it was inefficient, and it was slow. So the idea behind the Rideau Canal was, well, we can have a cheaper, more efficient, quicker transportation system between Montreal and the Great Lakes, and it would be nice and far away from the American border, meaning they would not be at risk of American attack. So I'm just going to forward through here. So this is a view of Ogdensburg, New York, from Prescott across the St. Lawrence River. So this gives you an idea of just how close some portions of the St. Lawrence was on either side between the Canadas and the United States. So it was pretty easy for the United States to set up a nice shiny row of cannons along the St. Lawrence and pretty much say to the British, you're not going anywhere. And essentially that would cut into the Canadas, causing the defense of the Canadas to be even harder than it was, because as we know, it's pretty treacherous in some areas of Canada and the northeastern United States now, and especially in winter. It was even worse back then, obviously. So the idea behind the Rideau Canal was it was a military construction project. It was meant to be able to defend the Canadas much better. That was its purpose. So in the late 1810s, early 1820s, some early surveys had been done of a potential route for the canal. Eventually, they had agreed upon a route, essentially the same route that it is today. And a man was chosen named Lieutenant Colonel John By to oversee the project in the Canadas. First, however, before we get into John By, before we get into the workers on the canal, I just want to mention specifically one other key reason as to why the canal, Rideau Canal, was built, and that is the lovely Erie Canal. So when they were analyzing the lay of the land, when they were saying, okay, where should we put this canal? How should we build it? They were taking their time, they were being thorough. And then a huge engineering project, a magnificent engineering project, was completed in upstate New York. And that was the Erie Canal. And they realized, oh, this thing can link, there you go, this thing can link the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. It can link to the Atlantic Ocean. This would immensely increase the potential of the United States in their eyes, because again, they're thinking of this from a military perspective. This would immensely increase their capability of mobilizing troops in the event of a war. Now, the British actually set up a commission to look into the Erie Canal, and they actually sent one of their men down to the Erie Canal to traverse the length of it. And essentially, he went along the Erie Canal, and at various points, so he went to Buffalo, he went to Rochester, he analyzed their lockage system, he looked at some of the aqueducts along the Erie Canal, and he said, okay, this would be good for sabotaging, this would be good for sabotaging, this would be good, we could blow this up so easily, just send a little detachment of troops across the way, and we can take care of it nice and easy. But of course, we're talking British soldiers, so first and foremost, they had to act in a gentlemanly way, so they actually wrote to their superiors saying, yeah, we could totally do this, but we know it's a little beneath us to engage in this sort of sabotage. But nonetheless, this just gives you an idea of how worried they were from after the construction of the Erie Canal, because they thought the Americans are light years ahead of us in terms of not only their defensive capabilities, but their offensive capabilities. And the offensive is what worried the British the most. So here we have an image of the planned route of the Rideau Canal, actually done by Lieutenant Colonel John By in 1829. So on the right of the image, you can see where the canal starts, and it follows a bunch of lakes and rivers through eastern Ontario. And then you get to the far left of the image, you can see Lake Ontario there. That's where Kingston is. That was the route of the canal. So in total, it would be 202 kilometers long, about 125 miles. double check that just to make sure. And the idea behind the Rideau Canal was, well, put it this way, some people refer to the Rideau Canal just like that. It is the Rideau Canal. Some people refer to it as the Rideau Canal Waterway. And that's because the plan they used to build the canal was, yes, there was going to be obviously some man-made portions of it. They were going to dig out some canal out of the bedrock, but the vast majority of it is using existing lakes and rivers. And at certain points, they would dam those lakes and rivers to flood the area, build a lock station, and that's how you would get from lake to river. It uses a slack water system, and it really says it all in the name, slack water. This was to create calm water for boats to be able to get from Ottawa to Kingston quickly, but safely as well. So in 1826, Colonel By arrived in the Canadas, and he planned this route. When he arrived in what is today Ottawa, they set up obviously some very rudimentary camps, and eventually a little town would emerge from that called Bytown in honor of Lieutenant Colonel John By. Talk a bit more about that later on. But work started in earnest, actual construction started in earnest in 1827, after the winter had passed, of course. And it was a pretty difficult life working on the canal. There were certainly no labor laws or anything like that. And there were about a few thousand workers working each year from 1826 to 1832. Unfortunately, estimates vary, but really a lot of people agree around 1,000 workers died in total by 1832 working on the Rideau Canal. Gunpowder explosions were very common, but the biggest killer along the construction of the canal was malaria. A lot of people are always sort of confused by that. They say malaria in Canada. Yeah, well, it was possible. There's a couple of theories as to why or how malaria made its way to North America. One of the most common I hear is a lot of the British troops that were stationed in Canada during the construction of the canal maybe had been stationed in India or in Spain in more tropical climates, and they had actually contracted it themselves and brought it with them. But nonetheless, malaria was a big killer. So malaria, from the French malaire, bad air. So what they did, as you can see in this image here, is obviously they had to clear trees for, to actually build the canal. But one trick they had was at different construction sites, they would cut down the trees in the entire area to get better airflow coming in. And the idea was, if the air around you is bad and is making you sick, well, if you cut down the trees, get better airflow in, you can get clean air in, and that would make you feel better. It's a really positive way to think about it. It's a really, it's a decent idea. Unfortunately, nowadays we know that probably didn't do anything. But nonetheless, again, hard life, hard work. When Colonel By arrived in what is today Ottawa, the area that is today Ottawa, he helped to lay out the first street plans of this new town. He was actually quite concerned about the way his workers were living. He wanted them to be as safely housed as possible. He was very concerned with the welfare of his workers. They were paid in American silver $50. And sometimes, however, if the shipment of silver $50 didn't make it in time to pay the workers, every so often they would sort of up the rum rations a bit and say, this should tide you over until the pay gets here. So it's, very planned, very, very meticulous in the plan they had for the Rideau Canal. But you know what? Sometimes you got to be a little flexible and adjust your methods a bit.
So I'm seeing a lot of similarities here with the digging of the Erie Canal.
There we go. Yeah, that's what I think. It's different areas, different countries, but they're both canals. So
canal diggers will always work for booze. That's for sure.
Now this here is Lieutenant Colonel John By. So it's impossible to talk about the Rideau Canal without talking about John By himself. So he was born in 1779 in Lambeth in England, attended the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. He was, initially he joined the Corps of the Artillery Corps, and then later on joined the Royal Engineers. So John By actually had experience with Canada before his work on the canal. So he was posted to Quebec City and Montreal in 1802 Funny enough, quite similar to his work on the canal, he was there to help improve the fortifications at Quebec City and improve the Lachine Canal in Montreal during his time there. So before he came to work on the Rideau Canal, he had experience both in Canada and working on canals, which is potentially one of the reasons they chose him when they were thinking of people to run the construction project on the Rideau Canal. Now in 1811, he returned to Europe. He was called back to Europe to serve under the Duke of Wellington during the Napoleonic Wars in Spain and Portugal specifically. And then he sort of went into semi-retirement in England after that. He was made lieutenant colonel. He was overseeing some gunpowder works in and around London. And by the early 1820s, he had married his wife Esther. He had had 2 daughters. And then he was approached to oversee the construction of this Grand Canal in Canada. Of course, he accepted, arrived in Canada in 1826 in Montreal, and then made his way up the Ottawa River to where the canal would begin here in Ottawa. So again, he helped lay out the first plans of what would become the town of Bytown, which eventually would grow into the city of Ottawa. Now, John By's story is grand, and it's, he's in charge of a great construction project, and this is for the defense of the Canadas, the defense of the empire. He's prominent, he's in charge, he has the power. However, when you're in a position like that, there will be people who, put simply, will make up any excuse to try to bring you down. So the sort of later half of John By's story is tainted in a way by accusations of misspending funds. Poor John By had a bit of a hard time with his superiors back in England, specifically around the size of the locks of the Rideau Canal. The original plan for the locks given to him was they wanted a more traditional style canal similar to the ones in England. So they wanted locks 20 feet wide by 108 feet long. These are the locks. This is the size of the canal that could sort of accommodate a typical canal barge. This is what they were looking for. They wanted, yes, we want a great canal, but we want it at a good price. Fair enough. John By had some grander ideas, let's say. He thought the best way to utilize the canal, if we really wanted to have a good transportation system to get troops from Montreal down to Kingston quickly and efficiently, the best way to do that would be to use steamboat transportation. So I don't know about anybody watching, but when I think of steamboats, you think of the big ships with the 2 big wheels on the side. And obviously they're a little bigger than a traditional canal barge. So Colonel By said 20 feet by 108, that's cool, that's cool. How about 50 feet wide by 150 feet long? How about that? I think that's better. And John By, being the go-getter that he is, or that he was, he essentially said to his workers, I think that's how we're gonna start to build with that plan in mind. Don't worry about the superiors, like I'll handle England, I'll tell them what I'm doing, don't worry about that. So he actually started to do that, and he hired, 5 contractors to help out with the work on the canal. So one of his plans was, instead of sort of starting at Ottawa and just building the canal bit by bit all the way down to Kingston, he hired these 5 contractors and gave them each a portion of the canal to focus on. So in Ottawa, for example, our museum's building is called the Commissariat Building, and that was built by one of the contractors named Thomas Mackay. Thomas Mackay also built a very nice manor house for his family that today is called Rideau Hall and is used as the official residence of the Governor General of Canada. So Thomas Mackay left a pretty good imprint on the city of Ottawa. So John By had these contractors. He told these contractors, listen, this is the plan I want, and I think it would be the better plan. I think I can bring them around to this. So just start digging. I'll take care of it. And then, of course, when he wrote to his superiors saying, I think the original plan is too small, so I was thinking we should do locks this big, they sort of freaked out. And they sent an engineering commission over to Canada to evaluate his work and to evaluate his plan. Now, although the commission still found that 50 feet by 150 feet is a little big and probably a little too expensive, they did acknowledge his reasoning behind wanting bigger logs. And so after a couple of these sort of back and forths, a commission actually recommended locks 33 feet wide by 134 feet long. And that is the size of the locks today. So he didn't get his way entirely, but he did convince them that having bigger locks would be more beneficial. And the work restarted. Now the problem is every time the work had to stop, every time there was a work stoppage, well, the workers were still on the payroll. So they still had to find money to pay them. And the problem with this was you still had to pay people for work that wasn't happening. So the budget sort of gradually increased and increased and increased, and the estimates kept being thrown out the window and again and again. And so this is where the accusations against Colonel Bai come from, because there was one estimate initially of what this sort of project would cost. And it was estimated it would cost about £170,000. Now, when I'm giving tours in the museum, I always like to ask people, so if the original estimate was 170 and he was in trouble for overspending, how much do you think he spent? You know, it's sort of a interesting question. You get all sorts of guesses. You get, 190, a million, you know, like it's all over the place. Well, if the original estimate was 170, Colonel Bai ended up spending around £820,000. So it was a little over budget, to say the least. And obviously, you know, when you send that spreadsheet back to your superiors and say, yeah, so we needed a little more money to do this, they weren't too happy. And there were there were people, you know, in the colonial office, in the British military, just sort of angry that he spent that much money. There were other people that had actually served under Colonel Bai who then genuinely accused him of sort of laundering money and corruption. So there was a variety of accusations against Colonel Bai there. And in fact, in 1832, right after he had taken his maiden voyage on the canal, starting in Kingston, coming up to Ottawa, he received a note from London recalling him back to England to face questions in front of a committee of members of Parliament. Now, he was acquitted of any wrongdoing, specifically with regards to charges of stealing money and corruption. However, because of the political climate in England at the time, it was very sort of a reform-minded climate, and Colonel Bai, through his work on the canal, was tied to the Duke of Wellington, who was seen as more of a Tory, more of a conservative, more of an old-fashioned kind of guy. Because of that, although he was acquitted, he was not given any sort of lump sum payment or recognition, official recognition of his work on the canal. So it was kind of a sad ending to his career. He passed away in 1836, just 4 years after the canal was finished. But nonetheless, our museum is called the Bytown Museum. Ottawa used to be called Bytown. So in more ways than one, we remember Colonel Bai and his work on the canal. Now, here we have an image of the plan of the approved locks, the approved size of the locks. So it's a nice cut to show you the plan they used to build the locks at different lock stations. Obviously, at different lock stations, the height that you had to go up or down differed, but this is sort of a standard look and what you would see specifically in Ottawa today with our 8 Ottawa locks here in downtown Ottawa. Nicely nestled between Parliament and the Grand Chateau Laurier. If you've ever been to Ottawa, you might have noticed the Chateau Laurier. It's the sort of castle-looking hotel in downtown Ottawa, right next to Parliament. But this is a nice cross-section of the plan they would have had and what Colonel Bai would have been allowed to do on the canal. Because although he had his own ideas and he had his own way of doing things, he still did have superiors. He wasn't given total authority to do what he wanted on the Rideau Canal. But nonetheless, it was between 1826 and 1832 that the canal was built. 1832 was the year of the maiden voyage. And by 1832, in the area that Colonel Bai had initially come to start planning the canal, a little town had emerged. In honor of Colonel Bai, they named it Bytown. And that is the beginnings of the city of Ottawa that we know today. So by some standards, even in North America, we are a fairly young city. We're celebrating our 200th anniversary in 2026. But nonetheless, it was a pretty good achievement, the establishment of this town. And most of the people who lived in this town initially were people who had worked on the canal, obviously. But just like in the rest of the northeastern United States, New England, upstate New York, the lumber industry was the industry that really took over after the canal was built. As I mentioned early on, the canal was built for military purposes, but thankfully, the relationship between the United States and the colony of Canada and the United Kingdom very much improved after the War of 1812, and there was no other war. It got a little dicey around the Civil War era, but we'll leave that for another discussion. And the canal was mostly used for economic purposes. The lumber industry was essentially the only industry in Ottawa after the canal was finished, and so the canal was used to transport lumber north south to the Great Lakes, and from the Great Lakes up to Ottawa, down the Ottawa River to Montreal to be sold off in the markets there.
So here, a couple, real quick, got a couple questions in our comments here. Someone wants to know, Bill Hecht wants to know, when did the railroad arrive in Ottawa, or Bytown, I suppose?
Oh, that's a very good question. So it would have been, if I remember correctly, it would have been probably around in the 1840s. I don't know the specific year. And unfortunately, I apologize, I don't know the name of the specific line, because there were a variety of different private lines in the area. I know the Prescott Railway was a big one. And that was on the land owned by a man named Bradish Billings, which today is part of Ottawa. His land is part of Ottawa. Back then, it would have been an entirely different township. So it's such a mealy-mouthed way of answering this question, but it's sort of, historically, when did it arrive in Ottawa? Well, it's a tough question. When did it arrive in like the city of Ottawa today? Around I would say in the 1840s, to the best of my knowledge. I'd have to double check that for you though. And I will be talking actually about a specific rail line as well with this slide, but I'll leave that if we have another question.
Oh, okay. Well, it was kind of a comment from Mike Riley, who's, I believe, the president of the American Canal Society, about the blockhouse in Merrick Falls.
Okay.
It's one of the prettiest sites on the canal outside of Ottawa. So
I completely agree. It's the legacy of the canal obviously is one of history, is one of sort of the creation story of Canada. But the physical legacy of the canal, I mean, obviously living here in Ottawa, we see it every day, we walk by it every day, we cross it every day. So it's you sort of become, I hate to say it, but you sort of become numb to it every so often. It's there and it's part of the city. I always found though, Eastern Ontario, and I'm totally biased because this is where I grew up, but Eastern Ontario is one of the most beautiful parts of Canada. And beautiful by these gorgeous buildings that were left after the construction of the canal. The city of Kingston is one of my favorite cities in Canada, and they have these beautiful Martello towers along the waterfront. And of course they have Fort Henry, which is also beautiful. But no, I couldn't agree more. They really put a good effort into building these things when they were back in the 1800s, but when they were building them, they were sure to make them, put really simply, look nice. And it's such a nice way to such a nice thing to appreciate these days. That's a fantastic comment.
Yeah, I'm struck by that because I always notice that. I assume you guys are kind of more along the European canal model line, which I think the Erie Canal is beautiful, but when I see like pictures of European canals, you guys actually made them. We were like, here's a ditch, transport boats on it. In hindsight, now it's gorgeous, the Erie Canal as well. But
yeah, no, that's
you go to the locks in Ottawa, like they're incredible to see. You guys have built up around them and everything.
Well, absolutely, and that's the thing. I mean, that's one thing the Ottawa locks in particular have to their advantage, which is like this image here from 1855, like that image there, it looks beautiful in and of itself. The advantage the Ottawa locks have today, though, is that, yeah, they're surrounded by Parliament, the National War Memorial, you know, the Chateau Laurier, parkland, and like it's very beautiful. It's very beautiful in and of itself. It's also very beautiful because the surroundings are quite beautiful.
Yes. But, yeah. Oh, and there was a follow-up question to the railroad thing. Did the railroad kill the canal?
So that's also a very good question. For a while, it put it on life support, let's say, because just like really anywhere where rail emerged as sort of the new transportation system, people sort of said, why am I slowly paddling down this body of water when I could be, you know, riding the rails and getting there so much more quickly. The advantage the canal had, let's say, and this is, I will be completely honest here, it's a bit of sort of extrapolation that I'm going to add into this answer. If we look at this image, you notice on the body of water in front of the locks, you'll see two little guys on a lumber raft. There's the steamboat, there's two guys in what looks like a canoe, and then there's two guys on a lumber raft. The way the lumber industry in Ottawa operated, and in a lot of places like the northeastern United States, it was by the log drive. So at one point there was no big railways, there obviously were no expressways or highways. So they transported the lumber on the Ottawa River, literally riding it like these two guys are, with their big PV hooks and their caulk boots to make sure they're stuck on the wood while they're riding it. But they would ride the lumber down the river physically. And so the one advantage the canal sort of had is that this was such a typical way of transporting lumber that it extended to using the canal to transport it. So even when the railways came in, they didn't entirely wipe out the economic uses of the canal, but as I mentioned, they did enough damage that eventually over the years, yes, people just said, there's really no point in transporting things along the canal. We might as well just use the railways. And then this is really, in the history of the Rideau Canal, there's sort of the first period where it was top of the line, brand new, everyone loved using it. Then the railways came in, it started to dip. And then there's this sort of period where really they weren't using it for economic purposes, they weren't using it for military purposes. And some people were using it for pleasure boating, but it hadn't really caught on yet. And that was a pretty decent period. That was a decent portion of the early 20th century. And then in the mid 20th century, people started to realize, yeah, we could canoe down and we could go camping. You know, we could use it as a sort of a fun way to get out into the wilderness. And then they really started to promote the canal that way. And then sort of from the mid 20th century on, that's when it really spiked for pleasure boating. So it didn't kill the canal in terms of economic uses, but it definitely did. I think putting it on life support would be the best way to put it.
Yes, I like that phrase.
Now, this view here, so this is from 1855. So 1855 is a very important date in the history of the city of Ottawa. That's when Bytown was rebranded as the city of Ottawa. Bytown itself had a pretty bad reputation. It was pretty violent. In fact, we were known as the most violent town in all of Canada at one point. So the people in charge of Bytown, sort of the town council, said, maybe it's time to, you know, get a different people thinking differently about our town. And the best way to do that, the quickest way to do that, was to just change the name. So in 1855, they changed the name from Bytown to the city of Ottawa. And we like to say sort of it must have worked because only 2 years later, Ottawa became the capital of the colony of the Canadas. So it was a pretty good change when we became the capital. So if we look at this picture on the right, you see there's a sort of a little house sitting atop the big hill there, the big promontory. That today is Parliament Hill. So that's where that's the location of the Parliament of Canada. If you slide back down that hill, just along the locks, on the right side of the locks, you'll see, well, on both sides, you'll see two little buildings. The one on the right is the Commissariat building. That was a storehouse during the construction of the canal. That is where the Bytown Museum is located today. And on the left side, you'll see the other building. That was the Royal Engineers Office. That's where Colonel By would have worked and would have had his offices when he was here building the canal itself. On the far left, of the picture. Along the waterfront, you see there's a little house there. That was the first post office in Bytown, and obviously most easily accessible by water. And the actual body of water in this picture is called Entrance Bay. Now this brings us to one always funny little thing that I think is more prominent than people say, but sometimes I seem to be the only one who focuses on it. And this is the debate over where the canal begins, where it starts, where the entrance is. So there's Ottawa and there's Kingston. And I have spoken to people. This is totally true, guys. I have spoken to people who say Kingston is the start of the canal. And you go, okay, well, why do you say that? Well, it's because when Colonel By made his maiden voyage on the canal, on the steamship called Pumper, renamed Rideau for the occasion, they started in Kingston and they made the maiden voyage from Kingston to Bytown. Now, the counterpoint to that is that this body of water we're looking at right here, right at the start of the first 8 locks, is called Entrance Bay. So I say, if you're entering the canal, you gotta go through Entrance Bay. That's just me. That's just me. Again, I'm biased. I grew up in this city, but nonetheless, fun little tiff there between 2 great Canadian cities. But a great view nonetheless. Oh, sorry.
Luckily, our viewers from Kingston aren't, rioting in the comments yet or anything.
Goodness, gonna start some trouble here. So 1855, Ottawa is a decently grown city by then. Of course, again, in 1857, we become the capital of the Canadas. 1867, 10 years after that, Canada confederates, we become a country. But nonetheless, a great view of the 8 Ottawa locks here. So the 8 Ottawa locks, very important to me as someone from Ottawa, very important to me as someone who works at the Bytown Museum that is 15, 20 feet away from those actual locks to this day. They're all still hand cranked as they were back when they were built. And the lift from the river to the canal is about 80 feet. Depending on the day, it takes about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes to go down the locks, about an hour to an hour and a half to go up the locks to the canal. So it's a great system. It's a great series of locks, and like we were saying earlier, it adds so much character to the city. It adds so much character to the area, which is funny to say because really the city grew up around those locks rather than the other way around. Now, this is another view of the city of Ottawa in Canada West, as it was known then, 1855. So sort of in the bottom right of this picture, you can get a little glimpse of the Ottawa locks there. The building you see sort of almost in the center, that's the Royal Engineers office again. That's where Colonel By would have worked. And in the bottom right corner, you might be able to see it sort of peeking out between the hill and the rocks, a roof of another building. And that again is the commissariat building. That's where the Bytown Museum is located today. So the canal obviously shaped Ottawa. I can't emphasize that enough. I love talking about the history of Ottawa. I love talking about the impact the canal had on it. But of course, it impacted the entire region as well. So it provided access to communities that were otherwise accessed by sleigh or by horse and buggy. So it improved access to the Great Lakes, of course. That was a great boon to the economy of Eastern Ontario. It provided, again, you wouldn't get the St. Lawrence Seaway until the mid-20th century. So the easiest way to get from the Great Lakes to Montreal for a lot of people would have been using the canal at Kingston, coming up to Ottawa and going down to Montreal.
We have a quick question.
Yeah, let's hide that.
Lynn says, when I was in Ottawa this summer, I noticed that the locks were open and closed manually. Are there any plans to change that or update the technology? I hope
that's a very good question. So along the Rideau Canal, there are a couple lock stations, if I'm not mistaken, that are hydraulically operated. So essentially, you got the big lock doors and you push a button and they open and close. The Ottawa locks, however, I have not heard any whispering at all about making them mechanically or electronically operated rather than hand cranking. It's, you know, at first I think it was sort of well, it would be way too expensive, too time consuming to sort of update these things. They work just fine. Why, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think at this point in time as well, there is that sort of added aesthetic element, which is, you know, you think about it, as I mentioned, Ottawa's going to be celebrating its 200th anniversary in 2026. And the fact that we could be celebrating 200 years of our city, and those 8 locks are still hand cranked, just like they were when they were first built in the 1820s, is something that a lot of people appreciate. That sort of preservation of history, that preservation of, you know, the way it used to be. I think people really appreciate that. It's really fun watching them as well. Like, not gonna lie, it's a great time on a nice sunny day like it is today, heading down to the Ottawa Locks and watching the Parks Canada employees opening up the sluice gates on the side to let the water through, and then when the water's balanced, opening up the main gate and then closing it up again, and just sort of following that slow trajectory of a boat going down the locks. So no, they haven't talked about updating them. They have done it for a couple lock stations, but that's as far as I know.
All right. Yeah. Well, I'm glad. I went there last summer too, and if you're into canals, you can actually see what it was like in the heyday of all of our canals. We also have a person who said he canoed as a Boy Scout back in the 1980s, all the way, the whole route of the canal.
Oh,
yes,
wow.
from Kingston to Ottawa. So
that's impressive. That is really impressive, because I was also in the Beavers, Cubs, and Scouts, as they're called up in here in Canada, and we did do, when in the Scouts, we did do a lot of canoe trips, and we did a canoe trip from Ottawa, so starting on the Ottawa River, and then going all the way down to a town called Perth, which is a little way down the Rideau Canal. And in Perth, they have the Tay Canal, or the Tay River as well, and they have some locks along that. So that's sort of what we did. That is nowhere near the whole length of the canal. That is really impressive. And it must have been fun too. It's both terrifying and fun going through a lock on the Rideau Canal in a canoe. I will tell you right now. It's really cool when you get in there, and then they start the water flowing in, and it's a little dicey.
yeah, I could imagine. I also, just a question I have. So you've talked about your museum being located in the commissariat building. Am I getting that correct? We're located in the Waylock building in Syracuse, where they weighed boats to charge them tolls. Did the Rideau Canal have anything similar to that? Did they charge
That's a
tolls?
good question. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any specific example. I'm sure they did, though. They have still today, obviously, a pricing system. But off the top of my head, I can't think of any specific location, but I'd be amazed. I'd be amazed if they didn't have anything like that, because you got to make it financially viable somehow.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting.
That's a really cool building to be a part of. See, I will say to our viewers, Derek has been great and has visited our lovely canal and our lovely city. To my great shame, I have not made it to Syracuse yet, and I have not visited the Erie Canal yet. So that is top of my to-do list as soon as I'm able to leave my apartment.
Yeah, oh, great. And I'll try to get back up to Ottawa, check it out again. Now I know more about it. But anyway, continue on.
Yes, so the city of Ottawa grew into Canada's capital. As I mentioned in answer to one of the questions earlier, the uses of the canal have varied greatly over the years. Initially, it was just to transport troops. After that, the lumber industry began to use it. More economic uses, just for general transportation of goods. And then there was that sort of period of decline. And then pleasure boating really started to pick up in the mid 20th century. And that's what most people think of when they think of the Rideau Canal these days. I mean, for example, the scouting trips going along the canal is a great example of that. It's a lovely addition to our land. It's a lovely addition to our city. And because it is so prominent in our cities and our towns here in Eastern Ontario, we've come up with obviously a variety of ways to use it. So I mean, you can go canoeing, you can go kayaking on the canal, just as something to do someday. But there are specific annual uses that we have. So you might have caught a glimpse of this picture earlier, but I'll bring it here now. So this is the Winterlude Festival in January and February. It takes place every year. The focus of it is on the canal because we have the canal, the Rideau Canal waterway becomes the Rideau Canal skateway. This is a great image. So that what I was talking about earlier, so you probably know or have an idea of what Parliament looks like. In the background there, you can see that sort of castle-looking building that is the Chateau Laurier in downtown Ottawa. So the Winterlude Festival, as I said, happens every year. Now, so I got into a tiff with the city of Kingston earlier. I'm going to get into another little tiff with another Canadian city right now, which is Winnipeg in the province of Manitoba out west. The Rideau Canal Skateway at one point held the record for being the longest naturally freezing skateway in the world. It was pretty impressive. We were really proud of it. And then Winnipeg comes along. And Winnipeg is at the confluence of the, if I remember correctly, the Assiniboine and Red Rivers. And when those rivers freeze in the middle of winter, technically, it becomes a longer skateway than the Rideau Canal. So we were all, I'm telling you, when that headline came out, it was not a fun day in Ottawa. I kind of find it, like at least ours is like an actual skateway, theirs is just two rivers freezing, but whatever. Don't want to throw too much shade at Winnipeg here today. But we got a way around that because the Rideau Canal Skateway then became not the longest skateway, but the largest, because the actual width of the canal is a lot wider than the confluence of those two rivers. So technically it is the largest naturally freezing rink. So we take pride in that still to this day, but as you can see, it's really fun. Thousands upon thousands of people come out every year for Winterlude, and it's a very popular festival. There were other festivals in Ottawa's past, one in 1922 called the Winter Carnival, and then there was sort of a gap of about 50 years, and then Winterlude started, and it's been going ever since. Now, obviously, because it is naturally freezing, the skateway does not always have the longest time frame on which you can skate on it. Some years it's a month and a half, some years it's a couple weeks, because if the weather gets too warm and the ice melts, well, you can't skate on it, or else you'll be swimming in the canal rather than skating on it. And in the middle of winter, that's not a good idea.
That checks out.
Yeah, so this is sort of the probably the most well-known modern day use of the canal, other than just sort of pleasure boating on the Rideau Canal. But it's a great time every year, and it's winter in Canada. You can either sit in your house and stay warm the whole day, or you can just sort of layer up and go out and do something. And they thought, we have this big sheet of ice right here, why not skate on it? I think that's a pretty Canadian way of looking at it. And just for all your viewers who haven't made it to Ottawa yet, really looking forward to you visiting at some point. But we have a lovely shot here of the locks, the Ottawa locks. On the left side, a little down the locks, you can see a building. That's the commissariat building, that's the Bytown Museum. So we're in a pretty prime location here on the Rideau Canal and on the Ottawa locks. But yeah, it's just, I can't emphasize enough how great it is to still have it operating like it did back when it was first built. We have the Winterlude Festival. This is a very popular place for people to just go for walks, go for runs. There's a dragon boat festival every year as well there's also uses. There's a little area called Dow's Lake, which is used to be called Dow's Great Swamp, but it was flooded during the construction of the canal back in the 1820s, and it became Dow's Lake. That's also a very popular place, especially in the summer months. and it is frozen over in the winter months during winterludes. It forms part of the skateway. But yeah, so I think we've adapted pretty well to using it. It's no longer needed for military purposes, obviously. It's no longer needed really for economic purposes either. So I think we've adapted pretty well to finding some fun ways to use the canal. And it's sort of a nice contrast when you think about it. You know, the original purpose of the Rideau Canal was military because there was an imminent threat of Canada being invaded. And, you know, fast forward almost 200 years and we're skating on it because that's what it's there for. And so it's a nice little, you know, negative positive contrast there. But nonetheless, you know, the history of the canal is the people who built it. The people who built it, I should say, you know, the workers on the canal, those thousands of people, is a nice cross section of Canadian society. You know, it was Irish laborers, it was Scottish laborers, stonemasons, it was French Canadian lumberjacks, it was English soldiers, and just like Colonel By himself, and in fact, even as well, the indigenous people in this area, the Anishinaabe, the Algonquin people, they actually helped survey the route because they obviously knew this territory better than any British soldier did at the time. So they actually helped survey the route from what would become Bytown down to Kingston. So it's obviously a very, very key role there. But that was sort of the makeup of these workers. And then of course, over time, oh, and I should say actually the funny thing about that is, so I mentioned the Scottish, I mentioned the Irish, I mentioned the French Canadians and the Indigenous, of course. One of the I guess it's kind of ironic aspects of the workforce that built the canal was there were quite a few Americans who came up to help build the canal. So it's sort of that funny idea of it was built to defend against an American invasion, and a great deal of that workforce was from the United States themselves. But nonetheless, we appreciate it, obviously. And I should say a great many leaders in Ottawa's history, men like J.R. Booth, or I should say E.B. Eddy, who was a great lumber baron in the lumber industry in Ottawa, Bradish Billings, who was also a great, he founded an entire neighborhood, what is today Billings Bridge in Ottawa. These men were Americans. They came up from Massachusetts, they came up from Vermont, and for various reasons, some just purely for economic reasons, other because we had these huge tracts of land that they could use. But nonetheless, there's a great connection between the history of Ottawa, the Rideau Canal, and the United States, not just because the Erie Canal scared the bejesus out of us when it was built, but just because a lot of our towns and cities were partially or sometimes entirely built by American settlers.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting little connection. Didn't know about that. We have another question on Facebook asking, do you have any idea how many boats go through the locks in Ottawa, like on an average summer day?
Yeah, that's a really good question. On an average summer day, on a day, let's see. So I've been working at the Bytown Museum for 6 years now, so I should have some idea. I really couldn't give you a solid number. It really depends on the day. I mean, like if it's rainy, you won't get that many. If it's sunny like today, you'll get locks. Sometimes you can fit up to 6 boats at once in a lock, going up all at once. So it really depends. Yeah, I couldn't give you a solid number per day, unfortunately, because it just varies so wildly. But there's definitely, although I will say the usage of the canal per year annually, unfortunately, is trending a little down. There's some spikes, like during Canada's 150th anniversary celebrations, they made the lockage free along the entire Rideau Canal. So there was a huge spike in usage that summer. But it is sort of trending a little down. There's still tens of thousands who go through every year. A decent chunk of those from the United States as well, coming up from upstate New York and New England. Yeah, I couldn't give you an exact number per day, but it's on a beautiful summer day like it is today in a regular year. Let's be specific about that. It's busy the entire day, from morning till afternoon. There will always be boats wanting to come through. Put it that way.
Okay. And I'm just noticing there not just noticing, I guess, but it's just a single set of locks. I know our famous flight of locks in Lockport flight, so you have to wait at one end of the canal here before you can go the other way for everybody to get up or down.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. It's funny actually in the summer. So you'll have boats down by Entrance Bay and all along the canal at the top, it's like a border crossing almost. Just waiting for Parks Canada's permission to get into the locks and either head down or up. It's really funny. But again, on a nice summer day when you're on a boat, like it's a pretty good wait. It's a pretty good way to wait.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, that's pretty neat. I definitely encourage all of our visitors, I mean our viewers here, whenever you can get to Canada, which who knows when that'll be, hopefully sooner rather than later, check out the Bytown Museum and the Rideau Canal. Also, we had another comment on Facebook saying the Trent Severn waterway is also a gorgeous set of canals.
Yes, absolutely. I don't want to suck up all the air in the room just for the Rideau Canal, although it is very impressive. But there are several local canals throughout Eastern Ontario, and even just doing. I always encourage the gentleman who commented earlier about the Boy Scout trip up the canal. If people ever get a chance, I would totally encourage them to take that trip, because the Ottawa locks are great, and Hartwell's, which is also another set of locks here in Ottawa, they're great. But doing the whole canal, you get to see Ottawa, you get to see Kingston, you get to see all these little towns and villages along the way, and it's such an incredible trip. But that being said, yes, there are other fantastic canals in Ontario that you could definitely check out as well.
All right, and we have a pretty cool question, I think. So the Erie Canal, we have our mule named Sail that pulled every boat on the canal. Someone asked at the beginning of the Rideau Canal's history, what was the main mode of power? I know you said that By took a steamboat down it, correct?
Yes. Yeah, so it was smaller sailboats and steamboats really were the two most prominent ones. Canoes as well, because canoes are so they're so versatile. They're so obviously integral to Canadian and North American history. They're very popular. But it's interesting actually, that question, just really quickly. So there were styles of canals where you had horses or mules pulling the boats through. And one of the original plans for the Rideau Canal, among that initial estimate that was only 170,000 pounds, one of the reasons it was so much cheaper was because they said, well, if we build a smaller canal, we can have, that sort of style of transportation. And then Colonel By was like, that's not happening. You're going to have self-propelling ships, because you can't have two horses on either sides of a lake pulling a boat through that lake to the next lock station. You just can't do that, So I think Colonel By really wanted to encourage steamboat transportation because it was the quickest, and you could pile so many more people onto a steamboat than a regular sailboat. But it was. I think I would imagine it would be sailboats or steamboats were the two most popular.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. I feel like we don't have a lot of those sorts of canals from the early 1800s, at least. The Erie Canal now, we don't pull boats on it anymore. But very, very cool. We also have another couple questions on Facebook. One, can you rent boats to go on the canal?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. That would be a question for Parks Canada.
There's got to be something around there, right?
Yeah, no, I would definitely. I don't think Parks Canada themselves has a boat that you could sort of rent for like a houseboat or something for the entire voyage of the canal. Yeah, no, I'll have to look into that, but that would definitely be sort of, if there's a frequently asked questions section on the Parks Canada website, I would definitely double check that. It would be really nice.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to take a boat down the Rideau someday. Also, another question is there any unique like geological features along the route that you know of to see, or any good guides to such a thing?
Well, the Friends of the Rideau Canal are a great resource. You can go, I would really recommend going online, checking out their website, because they have tons and tons and tons of resources and explanations for not just the canal itself, but each lock station and everything in between. Again, I would definitely check out Parks Canada, what they have to offer. I'm sure they have either some frequently asked questions or a specific guide regarding the geographical uniqueness of Eastern Ontario, which is where the Rideau Canal goes through. Off the top of my head, I haven't traveled the Rideau Canal itself other than here in Ottawa for a long time. So off the top of my head, I couldn't give you a specific sort of unique detail, although there are specific parts of the canal, not necessarily the actual nature around it, but the specific parts of the canal. So for example, the Jones Falls Dam, to the best of my knowledge, it's not in use anymore because it was built in the 1820s. But the Jones Falls Dam was when it was built, it was one of the largest arch dams in North America. And that's because the drop at Jones Falls was so incredible that they had to build this massive coffer dam to dam off the water in that area. So there are still, in addition to the existing buildings that they built, the defensive buildings, the military buildings, the Martello Towers, things like that, there are some unique engineering details along the canal. But put it this way, and this is the best way this is the most positive cop-out I can give, which is you gotta see it for yourself. You gotta travel the canal yourself to find it.
I wholeheartedly agree. Same applies to the Erie. And we did get a little confirmation on the boat rental question. There are indeed boats to rent. And if you go on the American Canal Society's website, they apparently have links that show you where you can take canal boat rides all over the Americas.
There we go. Fantastic.
So there you go. Well, Steve, I'd love to talk to you more about the Rideau Canal, but it's 11 o'clock now. So thank you again. And thank you everybody for watching. Please, I encourage you to check out the Rideau Canal next time you're in Canada.
Absolutely. And
oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say, if I might do a shameless plug here, if you'd like to learn more about the history of the canal and the history of the places around the canal, definitely check out the Bytown Museum's website. And we have a little video series of our own called Bytown Bit by Bit on our Instagram. So if you want to get some nice little history tidbits in 2 to 3 minute segments, check that out as well. But thank you very much, Derek, for having me, and thank you to the Erie Canal Museum. It's been really great.
Yes, thank you for joining us. All right, have a good day.